Thomas Reed sat at the kitchen table, staring at a half-empty coffee mug. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, making patterns on the worn Formica tabletop. In the living room, the television droned with morning news, the announcer's voice a meaningless hum of syllables. He rubbed calloused fingers against the ceramic surface of the mug, feeling its warmth seep into his skin. 43 years old, and here he was on a Tuesday morning, watching shadows crawl across his kitchen table instead of standing at his loom at Mohawk Valley Textiles. Outside, Utica was waking up. 6:27 in the morning, February 1977. The world still turned. Snowplows scraped against asphalt. Cars sputtered to life in the cold. Children complained about winter boots and homework, but inside Thomas, everything had stopped. "You should eat something," Thelma said, her voice breaking the silence. She stood by the stove, spatula in hand, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. A waitress at Marino's diner for nearly 20 years, she was used to early mornings, used to feeding people who needed strength for the day ahead. Not hungry, Thomas sipped his coffee, bitter. Like the taste that had been in his mouth since yesterday afternoon, when Mr. Kelsey had gathered all three shifts together in the cavernous main floor, and told them what everyone had been whispering about for months. "After 64 years of operation," Kelsey had said, his voice echoing off the high ceiling where dust motes danced in the slanting afternoon light, "Mohawk Valley Textiles will permanently cease operations effective March 15th. Thomas remembered how the words had hung in the air, like the cotton fibers that perpetually floated through the mill, settling on shoulders, in hair, in lungs. 6 weeks until the machines would stop, until the rhythmic clack-clack-clack that had been the soundtrack to his life since he was 18 would fall silent. "The kids will be up soon," Thelma said, sliding a plate in front of him, scrambled eggs, toast, the same breakfast she'd made him every morning for 15 years of marriage. "You need to eat for them." For them, Michael, 12, and Sarah, 9. Children who had never known a world where their father wasn't a textile worker, just as Thomas had never known a world where his father wasn't a textile worker. 3 generations of Reeds at Mohawk Valley. His father had died with cotton dust in his lungs 5 years ago, but at least he died with his dignity intact, with his identity intact. "What am I supposed to tell them?" Thomas asked, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Thelma sat across from him, her waitress uniform already on, ready for her 6:30 to 3 shift at Marino's. "The truth. That things are changing, that we'll figure it out." "Figure what out?" He pushed the plate away. "I'm a weaver, Thelma. It's what I do. It's what I've always done." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin was rough from years of hot water and harsh soap, cleaning up after others. "It's what you did, it's not who you are." But that was exactly the problem. Thomas didn't know who he was if he wasn't a weaver at Mohawk Valley Textiles. He'd started on the floor at 18, following his father through those big double doors, inhaling that distinctive smell of oil and cotton and sweat. He'd been so proud that day, stepping onto the floor, feeling the vibration of 100 looms through the soles of his work boots. "Daddy," Sarah stood in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her flannel nightgown hanging to her ankles. Her dark hair was a tangle around her face. "Why aren't you at work?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Come here, pumpkin." He held out his arms and she climbed into his lap, a warm weight against his chest. She smelled like sleep and the strawberry shampoo Thelma bought at the grocery store. "I don't have to go in today." "Is it a holiday?" "No, not a holiday." He looked at Thelma over Sarah's head. "The mill is closing in March. They're shutting it down for good." Sarah pulled back to look at him, her brow furrowed. "But where will you work?" "Where indeed?" Thomas forced a smile. "Don't you worry about that. Your dad will figure something out." The lie tasted acrid on his tongue. "Is that why you're sad?" Sarah patted his cheek. "Don't be sad, Daddy. You can get a new job." If only it were that simple. In Utica, New York in 1977, textile mills were closing one after another. Mohawk Valley was just the latest. First, it had been Utica Steam and Mohawk Valley Cotton Mills in 57, then Globe Mills in 61, Franklin Woolen in 68, each closure sending ripples through the community. Each one tightening the knot of anxiety that had lived in Thomas's stomach for years. Jobs were disappearing, flowing south like the Mohawk River itself, seeking warmer climates and cheaper labor. Or overseas entirely, to places Thomas couldn't even find on a map. How was an American textile worker supposed to compete with someone in Taiwan who would work for a fraction of the wages? "I'm not sad," he lied again. "Just thinking, go get dressed for school, okay?" Sarah nodded and slipped from his lap, her small feet padding across the linoleum floor. Thomas watched her go, wondering what kind of future his children would have in a city whose lifeblood was draining away, one factory closure at a time. You should call Tony, Thelma said, rising to clear the untouched breakfast. See if he's heard anything about openings at GE. Thomas nodded, though he knew it was pointless. General Electric had been laying off workers, not hiring them. The recession that had gripped the country since '73 showed no signs of loosening its hold. Unemployment in Utica had crept upward with each passing year. Men who had once operated machines now pumped gas, delivered pizzas, or didn't work at all. I'll figure something out, he said, echoing what he'd told Sarah, but the words rang hollow. Michael appeared in the doorway, his school books clutched against his chest, his expression guarded. At 12, he was old enough to understand what the mill closing meant. Mom said I should get my own breakfast, he said, watching Thomas carefully. Thomas gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down. I'll make you something. You don't have to, Michael set his books on the table but remained standing. Is it true about the mill? Thomas nodded. March 15th is the last day. Michael's face clouded. What are we going to do? That we hit Thomas like a physical blow. His son already saw himself as part of the equation, bearing responsibility that should never have been his. We're going to be fine, Thomas said, standing up and moving to the refrigerator. Eggs. I'm not hungry. You need to eat. So do you, Michael's eyes flicked to the untouched plate by the sink. Thomas sighed. I'll eat if you eat. A small negotiation, a momentary victory in a day already defined by defeat. Thomas cracked eggs into a bowl, whisked them with a fork, listening to the scrape of metal against ceramic. The familiar motions of making breakfast provided a momentary distraction, a brief reprieve from the questions that had kept him awake most of the night. What am I going to do? Who am I now? How will I support my family? The eggs sizzled as he poured them into the hot pan. Outside, a car horn honked Thelma's ride to the diner, Ruth Novick from 3 doors down who also worked at Marino's. Thelma kissed Thomas on the cheek, squeezed his arm, and whispered, "One day at a time," before grabbing her coat and hurrying out the door. One day at a time, as if time itself wasn't the enemy now. As if each day wasn't bringing him closer to March 15th, when he would walk out those mill doors for the last time. The date seemed cruelly appropriate, the Ides of March. Beware, Thomas served the eggs, sat across from his son, and forced himself to eat. The food tasted like nothing, but he chewed mechanically, swallowed, took another bite, modeled what he wanted his son to do. Eat, function, continue. Will we have to move? Michael asked, pushing eggs around his plate. No, Thomas shook his head firmly. This is our home. But even as he said it, he wondered. The house wasn't paid off. The mortgage stretched before them, years of payments still to come. How long could they stay if he couldn't find work? How long before they'd join the exodus of families leaving Utica, seeking opportunity elsewhere? Good, Michael nodded, relief evident in his young face. I don't want to leave my friends. Thomas felt a pang of guilt. He should be able to promise his son stability. It was what his own father had given him, a steady job. A roof overhead, the knowledge that hard work would be rewarded with security. But the world was changing, the promises were breaking. And Thomas Reed, third-generation textile worker, was watching his foundations crumble beneath him. Eat your eggs, he said, because it was the only certainty he could offer at that moment. You'll be late for school. The union hall was packed. Men and a few women from all 3 shifts crowded into the space, sitting on folding chairs, leaning against walls, an atmosphere of tension thick as the cigarette smoke that hung in the air. Thomas found a seat near the back, nodding to familiar faces, men he'd worked alongside for years, whose children played with his children, whose wives exchanged recipes with Thelma. Teddy Kowalski, union representative for 25 years, stood at the front, his broad shoulders stooped with the weight of the news he'd already delivered dozens of times over his career. Another closure, another meeting. Another group of workers left adrift. I know you've all got questions, Teddy began, his gravelly voice carrying over the murmur of conversation. I'm gonna try to answer them as best I can. The questions came rapid fire: severance packages, health insurance, pension plans. The cold arithmetic of lives disrupted. Thomas listened, trying to focus on the details, the numbers, but his mind kept wandering to broader questions no union representative could answer. Where had it all gone wrong? When had American manufacturing begun its slow, inexorable decline? What about the machines? Someone called out. Are they selling them off? Teddy's expression darkened. The company's already sold most of the equipment. It's being shipped to Brazil next month. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Brazil, their jobs, their livelihoods being packed up and sent thousands of miles away. They can pay workers there a quarter of what they pay us, Teddy continued. No unions, no safety regulations. That's what we're competing with now. Thomas thought about the looms he'd operated for 25 years. The intricate dance of warp and weft, the shuttle flying back and forth, creating fabric from individual threads. There was an art to it, a skill he'd honed over decades. Did the company think just anyone could step up to a loom and make it sing? What about retraining? A younger worker asked, his face still unmarked by the years of labor that had etched lines into the older men's faces. Is there money for that? Teddy nodded. There's a federal program, not much, but it's something. Representatives coming next week to talk about it. Retraining, the word hung in the air like a lifeline just out of reach. Retrain for what? In a city where factories were closing one after another, where would these newly trained workers find jobs? The meeting dragged on, but Thomas found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. The voices around him became a dull roar, like the sound of the mill floor but without its rhythm, its purpose, just noise. He slipped out early, nodding to a few colleagues who watched him go with understanding in their eyes. Sometimes you just needed to be alone with the grief. Outside, the February cold hit him like a slap. He zipped his jacket higher, pulled his cap down over his ears and began walking, not toward home but toward the mill. One last shift lay between him and unemployment, the night shift, 11 to 7. He'd been alternating weeks of days and nights for so long his body no longer knew what schedule to follow. Now it wouldn't matter. The streets of Utica were quiet in the gathering dusk. Thomas passed storefronts that had been vacant for years, their windows soaped over or covered with yellowing newspapers. Space available signs hung in dusty displays, hopeful messages from a more optimistic time. He remembered when downtown had bustled with shoppers, when Friday paydays meant the stores stayed open late, when the sound of cash registers ringing was as common as car horns. Now the silence was punctuated only by the occasional passing vehicle, by the wind whistling through empty alleys. Thomas pulled his hands from his pockets long enough to light a cigarette, inhaling deeply, watching the smoke dissipate in the cold air. His father had smoked Camels all his life, even after the persistent cough started, even after the doctors told him the cotton dust in his lungs was killing him slowly. A man needs his small pleasures, Frank Reed had said, lighting up as he sat in his hospital bed defiant to the end. Thomas wondered what small pleasures would be left when the mill closed, when the weekly paychecks stopped. When the routine that had structured his life for 25 years vanished like smoke in winter air. He reached the mill earlier than he'd intended, standing across the street to study its brick facade, the tall windows, the smokestacks that still belched steam into the gray sky. Mohawk Valley Textiles had been built in 1913 when Utica was a manufacturing powerhouse, when the textile industry employed thousands, when Made in Utica was stamped on products shipped across the country and around the world. Now it would join the growing list of abandoned factories dotting the Rust Belt landscape, another monument to American industrial decline. Thomas crossed the street and entered through the employee door, swiping his time card even though he knew it hardly mattered now. Inside, the familiar smells enveloped him, cotton fibers, machine oil, the sweat of human labor. The rhythmic clacking of the looms was a sound so constant he'd stopped hearing it years ago. Now he strained to memorize it, knowing soon it would exist only in his memory. "Hey, Tom," Jack Morley, floor supervisor for 30 years, nodded as Thomas hung up his coat. "Didn't expect to see you so early." "Couldn't stay at the union meeting," Thomas admitted. "Figured I might as well come in, get some work done." Jack's expression was sympathetic. At 58, he was too young to retire comfortably but too old to easily find new work. Orders are backing up. They're still coming in, like the company's not even closing. "Where will those orders go?" Thomas asked. "After Brazil, I guess," Jack shrugged. "Or maybe China, who knows, not our problem soon, right?" But it felt like Thomas's problem, like a personal failure. As if he and his fellow workers hadn't been skilled enough, hadn't worked hard enough, hadn't sacrificed enough to keep the mill running. Rationally, he knew this wasn't true. The forces at work were bigger than any individual global competition, corporate greed, changing consumer habits. But in his heart, he couldn't help feeling betrayed by the company. By America itself. "I'll be at my station," Thomas said, moving past Jack toward the looms that had been his responsibility for decades. They hummed and clacked, the shuttles flying back and forth, creating yard after yard of fabric that would soon be made elsewhere by other hands. For the next 8 hours, Thomas lost himself in the work. The repetitive motions, the concentration required, the satisfaction of seeing fabric emerge from individual threads, it had always been more than just a job to him. It was a craft, an identity. His hands moved with muscle memory, fixing jams, adjusting tensions, ensuring the quality that had once made American textiles the envy of the world. Around him, the night shift worked with subdued efficiency. There was none of the usual banter, the jokes, the shared complaints that had once made the hours pass quickly. Each worker seemed isolated in their own thoughts, their own fears about the future. At 3 in the morning, during the lunch break, Thomas sat alone in the cafeteria, a thermos of coffee and a sandwich Thelma had packed before leaving for her own shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the empty tables. Most workers had stopped bringing lunch, choosing instead to work through breaks, maximizing their remaining paychecks. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas looked up to see Terry Romano, one of the younger workers, only at the mill for 5 years. He gestured to the empty seat across from him. Free country. Terry sat, unwrapping a sandwich of his own. For a moment they ate in silence, the distant clacking of the looms providing a familiar soundtrack. "My wife's pregnant," Terry said suddenly, "found out last week." Thomas looked at the younger man, saw the conflicting emotions play across his face, joy at the prospect of fatherhood, terror at the timing. "Congratulations," Thomas said, meaning it despite everything. A baby was always good news, even in bad times, boy or girl. "Too early to tell," Terry stared at his half-eaten sandwich. "Hell of a time to be starting a family, huh?" Thomas thought of his own children, of the security he'd believed he was providing them. "You'll figure it out," he said, echoing Thelma's words from that morning. "One day at a time." Terry nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "My dad worked for Bossert Manufacturing, lost his job when they closed in '65. Never really recovered, drank himself to death by 70. The story wasn't unfamiliar. Thomas had seen it happen to others, proud men reduced to shadows of themselves when their work disappeared. Men who found solace in a bottle, in gambling, in anger turned inward or outward. "That's not going to be you," Thomas said firmly. "How do you know?" "Because you're talking about it, because you're scared," Thomas leaned forward. "The dangerous ones are the ones who think they're invincible." Terry seemed to consider this. "What about you? What will you do after?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. What would he do? At 43, with no education beyond high school, with skills specific to an industry that was disappearing, what options did he have? "I don't know," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "Find something, anything." "My kids need to eat." Terry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My cousin works construction in Syracuse, says they're always looking for guys. Maybe I'll head that way." Syracuse was only an hour away. Close enough to commute, though the winter drives would be brutal. Thomas filed the information away, another potential lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. "Worth looking into," he said. The lunch break ended and they returned to their stations, to the machines that would soon fall silent. Thomas worked methodically, each motion a prayer, each completed yard of fabric a small victory against the inevitable. When his shift ended at 7, he stepped outside into the pale morning light with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cotton dust he'd breathed for 25 years. Home was a small cape on the south side of Utica, bought when he and Thelma married in 1962. Back then, the neighborhood had been filled with young families, with children playing in yards, with the optimism of post-war America. Now many houses stood empty, foreclosed or abandoned as jobs disappeared and families moved away. Thomas unlocked the front door, stepping into the quiet house. Thelma would be at work, the kids at school. He had hours alone to face the questions he'd been avoiding. He showered, washing away the cotton fibers that clung to his skin and hair, the oil that had worked its way into the creases of his hands over decades. No amount of soap ever seemed to completely remove it. Mark of the trade, his father had called it. Now it felt like a brand, identifying him as part of a dying breed. Clean but not rested, Thomas made a pot of coffee and settled at the kitchen table with the newspaper. The headline confirmed what he already knew: Mohawk Valley Textiles to close, 300 jobs lost. Below it, smaller headlines told the broader story. Unemployment rises in Oneida County, GE announces further layoffs. Downtown vacancy rate hits record high. Thomas pushed the paper aside, unwilling to read the details of his city's decline. Instead, he pulled the classifieds toward him, scanning the job listings with growing despair. Retail positions paying minimum wage, temporary work with no benefits, nothing that could support a family of four, nothing that matched his skills. He circled a few possibilities anyway. Security guard at the mall, janitor at the high school, delivery driver for a local bakery, jobs he would have once considered beneath him, now potential lifelines. The phone rang, startling him from his grim assessment. He reached for it, expecting Thelma checking in from the diner. "Hello. Tom, it's Frank Kelly." Thomas straightened. Frank was his shift supervisor, a fair man who'd started on the floor just like Thomas. "Frank. What's up?" "I probably shouldn't be telling you this." Frank's voice was low, conspiratorial, "but they're looking at keeping a skeleton crew on for a few months after the closure. To help with the dismantling, shipping the equipment, that sort of thing. I put your name on the list." Thomas felt a surge of conflicting emotions: gratitude for the extended employment, bitterness at being asked to help dismantle the very machines that had provided his livelihood. "How many?" he asked. 20, maybe 30 guys, just through summer most likely, but it's something." "Thanks, Frank," Thomas meant it, despite the complicated feelings. A few more months of paychecks would give him time to find something else, time to adjust to the new reality. "I appreciate it." "Don't mention it, literally, they haven't made the final decisions yet. Just wanted you to know you're in consideration." After hanging up, Thomas sat in the silent kitchen, the ticking of the wall clock marking the passage of time he suddenly had too much of, a temporary reprieve, a stay of execution. But the sentence remained. He thought about the mill equipment being shipped to Brazil. American machines operated by Brazilian workers, making products that would then be shipped back to America, sold to Americans who could no longer afford them because they no longer had jobs making them. The circular logic of it all made his head hurt. Thomas stood, suddenly unable to sit still any longer. He grabbed his coat and headed back outside, walking with no particular destination in mind. The February cold had eased somewhat, the sun providing at least the illusion of warmth. He walked past houses where neighbors were at work, past the elementary school, where Sarah was learning about a world that was changing faster than the textbooks could be updated, past small businesses hanging on by threads as thin as the ones that ran through his looms. His feet carried him downtown to Washington Street, once the commercial heart of Utica. Now many storefronts stood empty, their display windows dusty and dark. He paused outside what had once been Karam's department store, where his mother had taken him shopping for school clothes each August, where he'd bought Thelma's engagement ring in 1961. A sign in the window announced a liquidation sale. After 86 years in business, another Utica institution was closing its doors. Shame, isn't it? Thomas turned to find an older man standing beside him, gazing at the storefront with an expression of resigned sadness. "My wife worked there for 30 years, the man continued. In the jewelry department, used to come home with stories about the folks who'd save up for months to buy something special. My mother loved this place," Thomas said. "Used to get all dressed up just to come shopping here." The man nodded. Different times, people took pride in things back then. They stood in silence for a moment, two strangers united in mourning for something larger than a department store. For a way of life that was disappearing before their eyes. "Where'd your wife go after?" Thomas finally asked. "After Karam's closed." The man's face clouded. "Nowhere, she was 62. Who's gonna hire a 62-year-old woman with arthritis? We're getting by on my pension from the railroad. It's not much, but it's something." Thomas nodded. At least the man had a pension. Many workers at Mohawk Valley would receive only a fraction of what they'd been promised, their retirement plans casualties of corporate bankruptcy and weak union negotiating power. "You work at the textile mill, don't you?" The man asked. "I recognize you from somewhere." 25 years, Thomas confirmed. "Heard about the closure, tough break." "One of many," Thomas said, gesturing at the empty storefronts surrounding them. "Seems like the whole city's closing down." The man shrugged. "It's the same all over. Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, the whole damn Rust Belt. They're calling it deindustrialization. Fancy word for shipping our jobs overseas." Deindustrialization. Thomas turned the word over in his mind. It sounded clinical, academic. It failed to capture the human cost, the sleepless nights, the strained marriages, the children who would grow up thinking their fathers were failures because they couldn't find work. "Well," the man said, pulling his coat tighter around him, "no use standing here freezing. Good luck to you, son." "You too," Thomas replied, watching as the older man shuffled away, a solitary figure against the backdrop of a diminishing city. Thomas continued walking, past the Stanley Theater with its ornate facade and faded glory, past the Hotel Utica where visiting dignitaries had once stayed, now struggling to fill its rooms. He remembered when downtown had buzzed with energy, when shops stayed open late on Fridays to accommodate factory workers cashing their paychecks, when restaurants and bars overflowed with people celebrating the end of another workweek. Now many of those same establishments had for lease signs in their windows, their owners having given up the fight against economic forces beyond their control. The few that remained catered to a dwindling customer base, their survival a daily battle. Thomas stopped at a small diner, not Marino's where Thelma worked, but a similar place called Jerry's that had been serving blue-collar workers for decades. He slid onto a stool at the counter, ordering coffee from a waitress whose tired eyes suggested she understood economic anxiety all too well. "Anything else?" she asked, setting the steaming mug before him. "Just the coffee, thanks." She nodded and moved away, attending to the sparse mid-morning crowd, a few elderly men reading newspapers, a couple of office workers on break, a lone salesman with a briefcase at his feet. Thomas stirred sugar into his coffee, listening to the murmur of conversation around him. Most of it centered on the same themes: closures, layoffs, the uncertain future of Utica. "Did you hear about Stevens Hardware?" one old man said to another, "closing after 97 years. "Not surprised," his companion replied. "Can't compete with those big box stores out on Commercial Drive. First the factories go, then the small businesses. Pretty soon there won't be anything left of this city but memories." Thomas sipped his coffee, the bitterness matching his mood. Was that the future of Utica, a city of memories, of empty buildings and aging residents reminiscing about better days? What would be left for his children if things continued on this trajectory? The bell above the door jangled, and Thomas looked up to see a familiar face, Tony Russo, his brother-in-law Thelma's younger brother who worked as a machinist at General Electric in nearby Schenectady. Tony spotted him immediately, his face lighting up with recognition. "Tom, thought you'd be at work or sleeping." "Day off," Thomas lied, not wanting to explain about the union meeting, about how he couldn't bear to sit through discussions of severance packages and retraining programs. Tony slid onto the stool next to him, ordering coffee from the passing waitress. "Thelma told me about the mill," he said, his voice dropping. "Tough break, man." Thomas nodded, studying his brother-in-law's face. At 35, Tony was still youthful, optimistic, seemingly untouched by the economic worries that plagued so many in Utica. But then GE was still hanging on, even if they had laid off hundreds in recent years. "Thelma said I should ask you about openings at GE," Thomas said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. Asking for help had never come easily to him. Tony's expression grew guarded. "It's rough there too, Tom. They laid off 200 guys last month. I'm only safe because I've got seniority and specialized skills." He hesitated, "But I can put in a word, you never know." Thomas nodded, both grateful and embarrassed. "Thanks. Anything helps at this point." "What about the retraining programs?" Tony asked. "Thelma mentioned something about that." "Haven't looked into it yet." Thomas stared into his coffee. "Not sure what I'd retrain for. Everything seems to be dying around here." Tony was quiet for a moment. "Have you thought about leaving? Plenty of guys from the plant have headed to Texas, Florida, places where there's still work." The suggestion hit Thomas like a physical blow. Leave Utica, the city where he'd been born, where his parents were buried, where his children had their friends in school. The city that, despite its decline, still felt like the only real home he'd ever known. "This is home," he said simply. Tony nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Just a thought, sometimes you gotta go where the work is." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, Tony occasionally mentioning mutual acquaintances or family news. Thomas listened with half an ear, his mind still churning with the suggestion of leaving, of uprooting his family to chase jobs that might not be any more secure than the ones disappearing from Utica. When they parted ways outside the diner, Tony promised again to inquire about positions at GE, though his tone lacked conviction. Thomas thanked him and headed home, the weight of uncertainty heavy on his shoulders. The house was still empty when he returned, the silence broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Thomas stood in the living room, looking at the framed family photos on the wall, Michael's school picture, Sarah's first communion, his and Thelma's wedding day. Moments of stability and certainty captured in silver frames. He moved to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of books he rarely had time to read. Among them was a high school yearbook from 1952, the year he'd graduated, and immediately followed his father into the mill. He pulled it out, flipping through pages of smiling teenagers with their lives ahead of them, with dreams and ambitions shaped by the post-war prosperity that had seemed permanent then. There he was, 18 years old, hair neatly combed, expression serious. Thomas Reed, the caption read, ambition to follow in his father's footsteps. And he had, faithfully, without question. Because in 1952, following your father into the mill meant security, meant a living wage, meant membership in the great American middle class. No one had warned him that the footsteps would lead to a cliff's edge. Thomas closed the yearbook, returning it to the shelf. He moved to the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a stack of bills: mortgage, car payment, utilities, health insurance premiums. The monthly arithmetic that had once been manageable on his mill wages now loomed as an insurmountable challenge. They had savings, but not much. A few $1,000s set aside for emergencies, for the kids' college educations. How quickly would that disappear if he couldn't find work? How long before they'd face the same choice so many in Utica had already made: stay and struggle, or leave and start over? The front door opened and Thelma called out, "Tom. You home?" "Kitchen," he replied, hastily gathering the bills and returning them to the drawer. She appeared in the doorway, still in her waitress uniform, her face tired but her eyes alert, assessing. "You look like hell." "Well, thanks. Didn't sleep." "Not much." He stood, moving to the coffee pot. "Want some?" She nodded, sinking into a chair. Ran into Tony at the diner. He said he'd talked to his supervisor at GE. "He told me." Not holding my breath. Thelma watched him pour the coffee, her expression thoughtful. Ruthie was saying her husband's company is hiring, window installation, it's not much, but... "I don't know the first thing about installing windows," Thomas interrupted, more sharply than he'd intended. "You could learn." He set the coffee mug in front of her with more force than necessary, liquid sloshing over the rim. "I'm a weaver, Thelma. It's what I do. It's what I've always done." "And now you'll do something else," she said simply. "Because that's what people do, they adapt." The logic was irrefutable, but it did nothing to ease the knot of anxiety in his stomach. Adapt, as if 43 years of identity could be shed like an old coat. As if the skills honed over a quarter century could be replaced with new ones overnight. "I might get a few more months at the mill," he said, sitting across from her. Frank Kelly called. "They're keeping some guys on to help with the dismantling." Thelma's expression was unreadable. "Is that something you want to do, help tear it down?" The question struck at the heart of his conflict. Did he want to participate in the destruction of the place that had defined his working life? Did he want to be complicit in shipping those machines to Brazil, where they would provide jobs to workers thousands of miles away, while his colleagues in Utica stood in unemployment lines? "It's a paycheck," he said finally, "a few more months of breathing room." Thelma nodded, accepting this practical assessment. "The kids will be home soon. What should I tell them?" "The truth, that things are changing." "That we'll figure it out." He echoed her words from that morning, finding some comfort in their simple pragmatism. She reached across the table, taking his hand. "We will figure it out, Tom, together, like we always have." Thomas nodded, wanting to believe her, wanting to share her quiet confidence. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the kitchen floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were facing something bigger than individual resilience could overcome. That the forces reshaping Utica, reshaping America, were as inexorable as the tides, as indifferent to human suffering as the machines that would soon be packed into crates and shipped across the equator. Outside, a school bus rumbled to a stop. Doors opened and closed. Children's voices carried through the crisp air. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, the rhythm of a life that continued despite economic upheaval, despite the slow death of American manufacturing, despite one man's crisis of identity. Thomas stood, squaring his shoulders, preparing to face his children with reassurance he didn't feel, with optimism he couldn't muster. Because that's what fathers did. They protected, they provided. Even when the world was shifting beneath their feet. Even when everything they'd believed about work and worth and the American dream was revealed as fragile, temporary, conditional. "We'll figure it out," he repeated, the words a shield against fear, a talisman against uncertainty. One day at a time. February gave way to March, winter's grip loosening incrementally as the days grew longer. Thomas continued working his shifts at the mill, each one bringing him closer to the final day. The atmosphere on the factory floor had changed, a strange combination of resignation and denial, of gallows humor and stoic silence. Men who had worked side by side for decades now avoided each other's eyes, as if witnessing a colleague's fear would make their own unbearable. Production continued, orders still coming in from customers unaware or unconcerned that Mohawk Valley Textiles would soon exist only in memory. The machines ran as they always had, rhythmic and reliable. Only the hands that operated them moved with a new urgency, as if trying to imprint muscle memory that would soon have no practical use. At home, Thomas maintained a facade of normalcy for his children's sake. He helped with homework, attended school functions, fixed the leaking faucet in the bathroom, but beneath the routine tasks of daily life, anxiety gnawed at him. The classified ads yielded nothing promising. His application to GE disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. The retraining programs offered by the state seemed designed more to satisfy political requirements than to genuinely prepare workers for new careers. One evening in early March, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a pile of bills before him, calculating and recalculating figures that refused to add up to security. Thelma had picked up extra shifts at the diner, but even with her increased hours, their income would drop dramatically once the mill closed. Dad. Thomas looked up to see Michael standing in the doorway, school textbook clutched to his chest. Hey buddy, need help with homework? Michael shook his head, hesitating before stepping into the kitchen. Can I ask you something? Sure, Thomas pushed the bills aside, giving his son his full attention. What's up? Jimmy Kovacs says his family's moving to Texas. Michael's face was serious. His dad got a job at an oil refinery. He says there's lots of work there. Thomas nodded slowly. The Kovacs were another mill family. Frank Kovacs had worked in the dye house for 20 years. That's good for them. Are we going to move too? The directness of the question caught Thomas off guard. He'd been careful not to discuss their financial concerns in front of the children, but kids absorbed anxiety like sponges, picking up on the unspoken tensions that filled the house. No, Michael, we're staying right here. But if there's no work here? There's work, Thomas interrupted. It might be different work than what I've been doing, but there's work. This is our home. Michael studied him, 12-year-old eyes surprisingly perceptive. Jimmy says his dad says Utica is dying, that there's nothing left here for working people. The words stung, partly because Thomas had thought the same thing in his darker moments. That Utica was a city in decline, a place where the American dream had packed its bags and headed south or overseas. Your friend's dad is entitled to his opinion, Thomas said carefully, but Utica's been here a long time. It's weathered tough times before. But what if? Michael, Thomas's voice was firm, we're not moving. This is where your friends are, your school, where your grandparents are buried, where our family has lived for generations. We don't run at the first sign of trouble. Or the second or the third, he thought but didn't say. The city had been in decline for years. Each factory closure, each business shuttered, each family that packed up and left for supposedly greener pastures had been another small wound in Utica's civic body. But was staying just stubborn pride? Was he denying his children opportunities out of some misplaced loyalty to a dying city? Okay, Michael said, not sounding entirely convinced. Can you help me with my history homework then? The change of subject was welcome. Thomas gestured to the chair beside him. What are you studying? The Industrial Revolution. Michael opened his textbook, revealing diagrams of early factories, of water wheels and steam engines. We have to write about how it changed America. Thomas stared at the pages, at the images of technological progress that had transformed the nation from an agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse. Progress that had created the middle class, that had made America the envy of the world. Progress that now seemed to be leaving places like Utica behind. Your grandfather would have loved to help with this, Thomas said. He knew everything about textile machinery. Used to take me to the mill when I was your age, explain how everything worked. Michael looked interested. Really, you never told me that. It was different then. They'd let kids in sometimes, especially family. Your grandfather worked at Mohawk Valley for 42 years, started when he was 16. And you've worked there 25 years, Michael calculated. That's 67 years of reeds at the mill. Yes, the number hung between them, the weight of family history, of tradition, of identity bound up in a single workplace that would soon exist only in memory. 67 years. Will I work there too? Michael asked, innocent of the impossibility of his question. Thomas felt a pang of something like grief. No, buddy, the mill is closing, remember. But you'll find your own path. Michael nodded, returning his attention to the textbook. It says here that factories moved near rivers first for water power, then later they used steam engines and could be built anywhere. That's right, Thomas pointed to an illustration. See, Mohawk Valley was built near the canal because they needed water for the steam engines and for the dyeing process. And now the factories are moving again, Michael said thoughtfully, to other countries. Out of the mouths of babes. Thomas nodded slowly. That's happening, yes. But why, if people still need the things the factories make? It's complicated, Thomas interrupted, not wanting to burden his son with the harsh realities of global economics. Companies are always looking for ways to save money. By firing American workers and hiring foreign ones who work for less, Michael said, with a certainty that suggested he'd been discussing this with friends whose parents were also facing unemployment. Thomas sighed. Something like that. Let's focus on your homework, okay? They spent the next hour working on Michael's assignment, Thomas sharing what he knew about industrial history, careful to keep his bitterness in check. As they worked, he was struck by his son's intelligence, his curiosity, his ability to connect historical events with current realities. Michael would have opportunities Thomas never had a chance at college, at a career less vulnerable to economic shifts. If they could afford it, if Utica still had anything to offer a bright young man by the time he graduated high school. Later, after the children were in bed, Thomas sat on the edge of his own bed, removing his work boots with the mechanical motions of a man who has performed the same action thousands of times. Thelma watched him from her side of the bed, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a novel open in her lap. Michael asked if we were moving to Texas, Thomas said, not looking up. Like the Kovacs family. Thelma was silent for a moment. What did you tell him? That we're staying, that this is our home. He finally met her eyes. Was I wrong to say that? She considered the question, setting her book aside. Do you want to leave? No, the answer came quickly, instinctively, but wanting and needing are different things. There's work here, Tom, maybe not what you're used to, maybe not at the wages you're used to, but there's work. She paused. Unless you think there's something better somewhere else. Thomas had never lived anywhere but Utica. His knowledge of other places came from television, from magazines, from the occasional vacation to the Jersey Shore or the Adirondacks. Texas, Florida, the booming cities of the Sun Belt, they were abstract concepts, not real possibilities. I don't know what's better, he admitted. I just know what's here, what's known. Thelma nodded. Then we stay, we adapt. We figure it out. Her practical approach to crisis had always been one of the things he loved about her. While he might spiral into worry, into existential questions about identity and purpose, Thelma remained focused on the concrete, the immediate, the actionable. The mill confirmed I'm on the list to stay on after the closure, he said, through summer at least, helping with the dismantling. Thelma's expression was carefully neutral. Is that something you want to do? He'd been asking himself the same question since Frank Kelly had mentioned the possibility. Was it a betrayal of his colleagues to help dismantle the very machines that had provided their livelihoods? Or was it simply practical to accept continued employment, however temporary, however bittersweet? It's a paycheck, he said again, as if repeating the phrase could strip it of its complicated emotions. We need the income. Yes, we do, Thelma agreed, but that's not what I asked. Thomas sighed, running a hand through hair that had more gray in it than he cared to acknowledge. No, I don't want to do it. I don't want to help them ship those machines to Brazil, but what choice do I have? Thelma set her book on the nightstand and moved closer to him, her hand finding his. There are always choices, Tom. Not always good ones, not always easy ones, but choices nonetheless. He squeezed her hand, grateful for her presence, for her steadiness in the face of uncertainty. I've been thinking about what Michael asked, about why the factories are moving overseas. And I couldn't give him a real answer, not one that made sense. Thomas stared at their joined hands. How do I explain to a 12-year-old that his father's job, his grandfather's job, the job that built this city, is now considered expendable? That American workers are too expensive, too demanding, too American. Thelma was quiet for a moment. Maybe you don't explain it. Maybe you just show him that when things change, we change with them. That a job is what you do, not who you are. But that was precisely the problem. For Thomas, for so many men of his generation, work and identity were inextricably linked. He was a weaver, a mill worker, a maker of things. Without that, who was he? I've never been anything else, he said softly. I went from high school to the mill floor, it's all I know. That's not true, Thelma's voice was firm. You're a father, a husband, a friend, a neighbor. You're the man who taught Michael to ride a bike, who checks under Sarah's bed for monsters, who fixed Mrs. Kowalski's porch steps after her husband died. The mill is just where you worked. It's not who you are. Thomas wanted to believe her, wanted to separate his sense of self from his occupation. But decades of conditioning, from his father, from society, from the American mythology of the working man, made it nearly impossible to disentangle the two. Get some sleep, Thelma said, kissing his cheek. Things often look clearer in the morning. But as Thomas lay awake in the darkness, listening to Thelma's steady breathing beside him, clarity seemed like a distant promise. The questions that had plagued him since the closure announcement continued to circle in his mind, relentless as the shuttles on his looms. Who am I without my work? What value do I have if I cannot provide as I once did? What happens to a city, to a country, when the work that built it disappears? And perhaps most painfully, did I choose the wrong path? Should I have left Utica years ago when the first signs of decline appeared? Have I failed my family by staying? The night offered no answers. Only silence, darkness, and the slow ticking of the clock marking time's passage toward an uncertain future. March 15, 1977. The Ides of March, the final day of operations at Mohawk Valley Textiles. Thomas arrived for his shift earlier than usual, parking his car in the nearly empty lot. The sky was gray, threatening snow despite the calendar's insistence that spring was just days away. He sat for a moment, engine idling, heat blowing from the vents, staring at the brick facade that had been as familiar to him as his own home for 25 years. Inside, the mill was unnaturally quiet. The machines had been shut down the night before, after the last orders were completed. Now they stood silent, like sleeping giants, their stillness more unsettling than any mechanical failure Thomas had ever witnessed. The air felt different too, the constant haze of cotton fibers already beginning to settle, the perpetual warmth of running machinery giving way to the natural chill of a large, poorly insulated space in March. Morning, Tom, Jack Morley nodded as Thomas hung up his coat. Not much to do today, just cleaning mostly, making sure everything's ready for the dismantling crew next week. Thomas nodded. The others? Most didn't see the point in coming in, can't say I blame them, Jack gestured to the quiet floor. Kind of depressing, isn't it, like a funeral? It was exactly like a funeral. The respectful quiet, the sense of finality, the weight of memory and loss. Thomas moved toward his station, where the looms he'd operated for decades stood dormant. He ran his hand along the metal frame of the nearest one, feeling the smooth surface that had been worn by countless similar touches over the years. How many miles of fabric had this machine produced under his care? How many curtains, sheets, tablecloths had gone into American homes bearing the invisible imprint of his attention to detail, his commitment to quality? They're starting to crate these up on Monday, Jack said, coming to stand beside him. The Brazilian crew arrived Sunday to learn the dismantling process. Thomas felt a surge of anger. They're sending their people here, why not just ship the machines and let them figure it out? Jack shrugged. Company wants to make sure it's done right. These old girls are temperamental. You know that better than anyone. Indeed he did. Each loom had its quirks, its particular rhythm, its unique sounds that signaled proper operation or impending problems. Thomas could diagnose issues by ear, could feel when a machine was running correctly just by placing his hand on the frame. That knowledge, accumulated over decades, would now be condensed into a few days of training for workers who would operate these same machines thousands of miles away. You're staying on, right? Jack asked, for the dismantling. Thomas nodded. Need the paycheck. Same here, 27 years, and this is how it ends, helping them pack up and leave. Jack's voice held the same conflicted emotions Thomas felt, the bitterness of betrayal mingled with the pragmatic need for continued income. They spent the morning in mundane tasks, cleaning work areas, organizing tools, completing paperwork. Around them, the few workers who had chosen to come in for the final day moved with the subdued efficiency of people performing familiar actions for the last time. At noon, Mr. Kelsey called everyone to the cafeteria. 24 men gathered, a fraction of the workforce that had once filled 3 shifts. A table had been set up with coffee, donuts, a sheet cake bearing the message, "Thank you for your service," in blue icing. A corporate farewell as impersonal as the decision to close the mill had been. Kelsey, to his credit, looked uncomfortable with the proceedings. A company man to his core, he nevertheless had worked his way up from the floor, had known most of these men for decades, had shared in their triumphs and struggles. "I want to thank you all for coming in today," he began, his voice echoing in the half-empty cafeteria. "I know it wasn't easy." An understatement of magnificent proportions. Thomas stood at the back of the room, coffee untouched, unwilling to participate in the pretense that cake and platitudes could soften the blow of what was happening. "Mohawk Valley Textiles has been a part of this community for 64 years, Kelsey continued. "The work you've done here, the products you've made, have gone into homes across America. You should be proud of that legacy." Legacy, as if they were retiring voluntarily, as if the mill were closing because its time had naturally come to an end, rather than being sacrificed on the altar of corporate profit margins. "The company has asked me to express their gratitude for your years of dedicated service. Your final paychecks include the severance packages outlined in the union agreement, and as you know, there's a retraining program available for those interested. Information packets are on the table by the door." Thomas watched the faces of his colleagues as Kelsey spoke. Some nodded stoically, others stared at the floor, a few wore expressions of barely contained anger. All seemed to understand the inadequacy of this moment, this corporate ritual of separation that failed to acknowledge the depth of what was being lost. When Kelsey finished, a few men stepped forward to shake his hand, to exchange words of farewell. Thomas remained at the back of the room, unwilling to participate in the charade. Eventually, most drifted away, back to their stations for one last look, or out the door toward uncertain futures. Only those who, like Thomas, would be staying on for the dismantling remained. "You didn't want cake," Jack appeared beside him, a paper plate in his hand bearing a slice of the farewell dessert. "Not hungry." Jack nodded. "Me neither, really. Seems wrong somehow, celebrating the death of something." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as a maintenance worker began cleaning up, throwing away paper plates, plastic utensils, the physical evidence of the mill's final gathering. "What will you do after?" Thomas finally asked. "After the dismantling work is done?" Jack sighed. "My brother-in-law has a roofing company in Rochester, says he can use an extra man. Not what I had in mind for my 50s, crawling around on rooftops, but it's something." Thomas nodded, mentally adding Jack to the growing list of people who would be leaving Utica. "Rochester's not too far. You'll be able to come back and visit." "Maybe," Jack set his uneaten cake on a nearby table, "or maybe it's better to make a clean break, start fresh somewhere new." The idea still felt like betrayal to Thomas. Abandoning Utica seemed like abandoning part of himself, like surrendering to the forces that were tearing communities apart across the Rust Belt. But who was he to judge? Each person had to find their own way through the economic wilderness that was 1970s America. "Well, good luck, whatever you decide," Thomas said, extending his hand. Jack shook it firmly. "You too, Tom. You were always one of the best on the floor. Those Brazilians are going to have big shoes to fill." The compliment, sincere and unexpected, caught Thomas off guard. "Just did my job." "Did it better than most." Jack released his hand. "I'll see you Monday for the dismantling briefing. Kelsey says we're meeting the Brazilian crew at 9. Thomas nodded, already dreading the encounter. How would he feel, showing these foreigners the machines he'd operated for decades? Teaching them to dismantle the very equipment that had provided his livelihood, so it could be shipped to their country while he and his colleagues faced unemployment. The rest of the day passed slowly. Thomas moved through his final tasks mechanically, his mind elsewhere, cataloging memories of his years at the mill. His first day, terrified and excited, his father showing him the ropes, the satisfaction of mastering the complex machinery. The camaraderie of the floor, men working together in the orchestrated chaos of industrial production. The pride of seeing finished products emerge from raw materials, the tangible evidence of his labor. At the end of his shift, he stood before his looms one last time. Silent now, their shuttles still, they seemed smaller somehow, less imposing, just machines after all. Metal and wood and mechanical ingenuity, designed to perform a specific task, now deemed more valuable elsewhere. "Ready to go," Jack appeared at his shoulder. "Kelsey's locking up." Thomas nodded, reluctantly turning away from the machines that had been his responsibility for so long. As they walked toward the exit, passing darkened workstations and empty offices, the full weight of the day settled on him. This wasn't just the end of a job, It was the end of an era both personally and for Utica itself. Outside, the threatened snow had materialized, large flakes drifting lazily from a steel-gray sky. Thomas stood for a moment, watching as they accumulated on the windshields of the few remaining cars in the parking lot. March snow never lasted long, but it seemed fitting somehow, a brief, beautiful shroud for the dying industrial heart of the city. "See you Monday," Jack called, heading toward his own car. Thomas raised a hand in acknowledgement but remained standing in the gently falling snow, unwilling to leave, to make final this day of endings. Behind him, the mill loomed, its windows dark, its smokestacks cold. For 64 years, it had been a place of creation, of productivity, of purpose. Now it would become another empty shell, another monument to America's industrial decline. Eventually, the cold drove him to his car. The drive home took him past other shuttered factories, past neighborhoods where for sale signs outnumbered Christmas decorations in December, past downtown storefronts with soaped-over windows. The Utica of his youth was disappearing, building by building, job by job, family by family. At home, Thelma was waiting, her face questioning as he entered. How was it? "Quiet," he said, removing his coat. "Not many came in. Just those of us staying on for the dismantling." She nodded, understanding. "I made pot roast, your favorite." A gesture of comfort, of normalcy in a day that had been anything but normal. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for her steadiness, for her practical approach to crisis. "Smells good." They moved around each other in the kitchen with the practiced ease of a long marriage, setting the table, filling glasses, preparing for the children's return from school. Ordinary actions that suddenly seemed precious in their continuity, in their resistance to the disruptions of economic change. "I was thinking," Thelma said as they worked, "about what you said last night. About never being anything but a mill worker." Thomas glanced at her, wary of where this might be leading. "Remember when we first bought this house, how the bathroom sink kept leaking and we couldn't afford a plumber?" He nodded, remembering those early days of homeownership, of financial strain, of learning by necessity. "You fixed it," Thelma continued. "You bought a book, studied it, figured it out, and the porch steps, and the loose shingles after that storm, and Mrs. Kowalski's fence." "That's different," Thomas protested. "That's just handyman stuff." "Anyone can do that." "Not anyone," Thelma corrected. You're good with your hands. You understand how things work, how to fix them when they break." Thomas saw where she was going with this and shook his head. "Thelma, being able to fix a leaky sink doesn't translate to a career." "Why not? People always need things fixed, especially now when money's tight and everyone's trying to make things last longer." The idea seemed absurd on its face. Him a handyman, a repairman. It was the kind of work he'd always considered temporary, what men did between real jobs. "The mill is real work," he said, voicing the thought that had been in his head. "Making things, producing." "That's what I know." Thelma's expression softened. "Fixing things is real work too, Tom, necessary work, work that helps people, that makes a difference in their daily lives." Before he could respond, the front door opened and Sarah's voice called out, "Mom." "Dad, we're home." The conversation ended there, replaced by the immediate demands of children returning from school, homework to supervise, stories to hear, small crises to navigate. But Thelma's words lingered in Thomas's mind throughout the evening, a small seed planted in the barren soil of his unemployment anxiety. Later, after the children were in bed, Thomas sat in the living room with the television on low, not really watching the program but needing the background noise to fill the silence of his thoughts. Thelma joined him, sitting close on the sofa, her presence a comfort. "I didn't mean to dismiss your idea," he said after a while, "about fixing things." She nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I just never saw myself doing that kind of work. It's not what my father did, not what I was raised to do." "Times change," Thelma said simply. "Your father didn't face what you're facing. He had the security of knowing the mill would always be there." "He thought it would always be there," Thomas corrected. "We all did, that was the mistake." Thelma was quiet for a moment, considering. Maybe the mistake was believing that any job, any industry is permanent, that we can count on things staying the same. The observation hit Thomas with unexpected force. Wasn't that exactly what he'd been taught? That a man found his work, committed to it, built his life around it, and was rewarded with security and stability. The social contract that had defined American working life for generations was being rewritten before his eyes, and he had no idea what the new terms would be. I don't know how to live in a world where nothing is certain, he admitted, the confession feeling like weakness. Thelma took his hand. Nothing ever was certain, Tom. We just believed it was, and maybe that was enough, the believing. It gave us confidence, let us make plans, raise our children without constant fear. She paused. But the truth is, everything changes, everything ends eventually. The question is how we adapt. Adapt, there was that word again. As if a lifetime of identity, of skills developed and honed, of belonging to a particular tradition of work, could simply be exchanged for something new. As if he could become someone else overnight. I don't know if I can, he said softly. You already have many times, Thelma's voice was firm. You adapted when your father died, when the children were born. When the new machines were brought in at the mill, you're stronger than you think, more flexible. Thomas wanted to believe her, wanted to see in himself the resilience she described. But as the television flickered with images of a world that seemed increasingly unfamiliar, he couldn't shake the feeling that this challenge was different, more fundamental. This wasn't about adapting to a new machine or a new shift schedule. This was about reinventing himself entirely at an age when most men were settling into the established rhythms of their working lives. One day at a time, Thelma said, echoing her earlier advice. That's all any of us can do. One day at a time, starting with Monday when he would meet the Brazilian workers who would take his machines, his job, his identity back to their country. One day at a time through the dismantling of the mill, through the unemployment that would follow, through whatever came next in this new, uncertain world. Thomas nodded, squeezing Thelma's hand, drawing strength from her practical wisdom, her steady presence. One day at a time, he repeated, the words a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty, a promise to try to adapt, to survive in a world where the only constant was change itself. Monday morning arrived with the reluctance of a condemned man approaching the gallows. Thomas woke before the alarm, staring at the ceiling while Thelma slept beside him, her breathing soft and regular in the pre-dawn darkness. 5:27, the time he'd awakened for decades, his body's internal clock more reliable than any manufactured timepiece. But today was different. Today he wasn't rising to operate looms, to create fabric, to contribute to the manufacturing output that had once made Utica and America industrial powerhouses. Today he was rising to begin the dismantling process, to prepare the machinery for its journey to Brazil, to participate in what felt like a betrayal of everything he'd believed about work and country and loyalty. He showered and dressed mechanically, the routine actions requiring no conscious thought. Downstairs he made coffee, standing in the kitchen as the pot gurgled and hissed, filling the room with a familiar aroma that did nothing to dispel his sense of displacement. You're up early, Thelma said from the doorway, her robe pulled tight against the morning chill. I thought you didn't have to be there until 9. Couldn't sleep, Thomas poured coffee into his thermos. Thought I'd go in early, get a feel for what we're doing. Thelma studied his face, her expression concerned. You don't have to do this, Tom, we could figure something else out. But they both knew there were something else available in Utica in 1977. The employment office was already overflowing with laid-off factory workers. The retraining programs were oversubscribed, underfunded, and often led to jobs that paid a fraction of what manufacturing had offered. It's fine, Thomas said, not meeting her eyes. It's a paycheck. The phrase had become his mantra, his justification for participating in the dismantling of his own livelihood. Just a paycheck. Just a way to pay bills, to keep food on the table, to maintain some semblance of the life they'd built. Thelma didn't press the issue. Instead, she moved to the refrigerator, pulling out eggs, bread, the everyday actions of feeding a family continuing despite the seismic shifts in their circumstances. I'll be home for dinner, Thomas said, kissing her cheek before heading toward the door. Tell the kids I said goodbye. Outside, the March morning was cold but clear, the snow from Friday already melting in patches where the sun hit directly. Thomas started his car, waiting for the engine to warm before pulling away from the curb. The streets were quiet at this hour, the city still waking, still unaware or unconcerned that another piece of its industrial heart was being prepared for export. At the mill, the parking lot held only a few cars, other early arrivers like himself, men who couldn't sleep, who needed to confront this day on their own terms. Thomas recognized Jack's station wagon, Frank Kelsey's Buick, a few others belonging to maintenance staff who had been retained for the dismantling. Inside, the mill felt different, emptier certainly, with most of the workforce gone. But there was something else too, a change in the very atmosphere of the place. Without the constant hum of machinery, without the bustle of 3 shifts of workers moving through their tasks, the building felt like what it was becoming: a shell, a husk, an abandoned monument to an industry in decline. Thomas made his way to the main floor, where his looms stood silent in the pale morning light filtering through high windows. He wasn't alone. Other men moved among the machines, touching them with the reverence of mourners at a viewing, saying goodbye in their own ways to the equipment that had structured their working lives. "Early bird," Jack commented, appearing beside him. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" Thomas shrugged. Seemed wrong to just show up at 9 like it's any other Monday. Jack nodded, understanding. "Kelsey says the Brazilians arrived yesterday, staying at the Holiday Inn. They'll be here at 9 sharp for the orientation." The mention of the foreign workers sent a spike of resentment through Thomas. Intellectually, he knew they weren't to blame. They were just men taking an opportunity offered to them, supporting their own families, participating in a global economic system they hadn't created. But emotionally, they represented everything that was wrong with what was happening: American jobs going overseas, American manufacturing declining, American workers discarded like outdated machinery. "How many?" he asked. "6. Young guys mostly, engineers and mechanics who will oversee the setup in Sao Paulo." Jack paused. "Kelsey says we're supposed to teach them everything we know, like 25 years of experience can be downloaded in a few weeks." The absurdity of it might have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Thomas had learned his craft from his father, who had learned from his father before him. The knowledge had been passed down through generations, refined, adapted, embodied in the very muscles and reflexes of the men who operated the machinery. And now it was expected to be transferred in a crash course to workers who would take that knowledge thousands of miles away. "We'll teach them what we have to," Thomas said, the bitterness evident in his voice despite his attempt at neutrality. Jack gave him a sidelong look. "Just enough to get the machines out of here. Not our fault if they have trouble setting up on the other end, right?" The suggestion of sabotage, however passive, hung in the air between them. Thomas considered it for a moment, the small satisfaction of withholding some crucial piece of information, of ensuring the Brazilian operation would face difficulties. But what would be the point? It wouldn't bring the jobs back to Utica. It wouldn't reopen the mill. It would just be petty revenge against men who, like themselves, were simply trying to make a living in a world where the rules seemed increasingly stacked against ordinary workers. "We'll do the job we're paid to do," Thomas said finally, "no more, no less." Jack nodded, though his expression suggested he might have his own ideas about how thoroughly to share his knowledge. The next few hours passed in preparation, reviewing dismantling plans, organizing tools, clearing workspace around the machines. By 8:45, a group of men had gathered near the main entrance, waiting with varying degrees of apprehension for the arrival of the Brazilian team. Thomas stood slightly apart, smoking a cigarette, watching the clock on the wall tick toward the appointed hour. At 9 precisely, Frank Kelsey appeared, leading a group of men through the doors onto the main floor. The Brazilians were immediately identifiable by their crisp clothes, their alert expressions, their air of anticipation. Young, as Jack had said, professionals rather than floor workers, their hands uncalloused, their posture suggesting education and authority rather than years of physical labor. "Gentlemen," Kelsey called, gathering everyone's attention, "I'd like to introduce the team from Sao Paulo who will be working with us on the dismantling and relocation project." The introductions were brief, perfunctory. Names that sounded exotic to American ears: Carlos, Mateo, Joe, attached to men who smiled politely, nodded, extended hands that were shaken with reluctant courtesy by the Utica workers. Thomas hung back, observing, noting the awkward dynamic, the barely concealed resentment on one side, the professional enthusiasm on the other. "We are very grateful for your assistance," one of the Brazilians said, his English accented but fluent. "The expertise you bring will be invaluable in ensuring a smooth transition." Smooth transition, the corporate euphemism for the gutting of an American factory, for the export of American jobs, for the betrayal of American workers. Thomas felt his jaw tighten, his hands clench at his sides. He forced himself to relax, to nod when introduced, to shake hands with mechanical politeness. The Brazilian assigned to work with him was named Diego, a young engineer who looked to be in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes and a manner that was professional without being condescending. "You have operated these machines for many years, yes?" he asked as they stood before Thomas's looms. 25, Thomas replied, the brevity of his answer communicating his reluctance to engage. Diego nodded, seeming to understand the tension inherent in the situation. "That is a lifetime of knowledge. I hope you will share some of it with me so these machines can continue to produce quality fabric in their new home." The directness of the statement, the acknowledgement of what was being lost and taken, caught Thomas off guard. He had expected corporate platitudes, empty reassurances about global markets and economic necessity, not this simple recognition of the human cost. "I'll show you what you need to know," Thomas said, his voice softening slightly. "It's my job." For now, he added silently. For 6 more weeks, until the last machine was crated and shipped, until the mill stood empty, until he joined the ranks of the unemployed in a city increasingly defined by what it had lost rather than what it contained. The day progressed in a blur of technical discussions, of demonstrations, of explanations about how to disassemble complex machinery without damaging critical components. Thomas found himself falling back on the teaching skills he'd developed training new workers over the years, explaining processes, pointing out potential problems, sharing the accumulated wisdom of decades on the floor. Diego proved to be an attentive student, asking intelligent questions, taking notes, showing genuine respect for Thomas's expertise. Despite himself, Thomas found his initial resentment giving way to a grudging professional regard. The Brazilian wasn't to blame for global economic forces, for corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms, for an American economic policy that seemed increasingly indifferent to the fate of manufacturing workers. At lunch, the two groups separated naturally, Utica workers gathering at one end of the cafeteria, Brazilians at the other, the physical distance reflecting the gulf of experience and circumstance that divided them. Thomas sat with Jack and several others, listening to their subdued conversations, their gallows humor about teaching foreigners to take their jobs. "Mine barely speaks English," one man complained. "How am I supposed to explain calibration procedures to someone who doesn't understand the words?" "At least yours is trying," another replied. "Mine just stands there with this smug look like he already knows everything." "They don't know shit," Jack interjected. "That's why they need us, to teach them what took us years to learn." Thomas glanced toward the Brazilians, noting their animated conversation, their professional demeanor, their obvious education and training. "They're not stupid," he said quietly. "They're engineers, mechanics, they know machinery, they just need to learn the specifics of these machines." Jack gave him a look that suggested betrayal. "Whose side are you on, Tom?" The question hung in the air, its implications extending far beyond the immediate situation. Whose side was he on? The side of American workers losing their jobs to global competition? Or the side of practical adaptation to changing economic realities? "I'm on the side of doing the job I'm being paid to do," Thomas said finally. "I need the paycheck same as you." Jack seemed to accept this, nodding reluctantly. "Yeah, I get it, but it doesn't mean I have to like these guys, or make it easy for them to take our livelihood back to Brazil." Thomas understood the sentiment, felt it himself despite his grudging respect for Diego's professionalism. But as the lunch break ended and they returned to the floor, he found himself wondering about the Brazilian workers' lives, their families, their hopes and fears. Were they so different from the men of Utica? Weren't they also trying to provide for their children, to secure a future in an uncertain world, to find dignity and purpose in their work? The afternoon passed in continued orientation, in planning for the dismantling that would begin in earnest the following day. By 5 o'clock, when the shift ended, Thomas was mentally exhausted from the effort of teaching, from the emotional strain of participating in the export of his own livelihood, from the constant reminder that everything he'd built his life around was changing irrevocably. Outside, the March evening was chilly, the sun setting earlier than it would a few weeks hence when daylight saving time began. Thomas stood in the parking lot, lighting a cigarette, watching as workers and Brazilians emerged from the building, separating into their respective groups, heading toward cars or the waiting van that would take the foreign team back to their hotel. Diego approached, zipping his jacket against the cold. "Mr. Reid," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for your patience today. I learned a great deal." Thomas shook the offered hand briefly. "There's a lot more to learn. Yes, of course, these machines, they are complex, but with your guidance I believe we will manage." Diego hesitated, then added, "I understand this is difficult for you, for all of you. If our situations were reversed, I would feel the same." The simple acknowledgement of the human cost, offered without corporate euphemism or empty platitude, caught Thomas off guard again. "It's just business, right?" he said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Nothing personal." Diego's expression was thoughtful. Business for the companies, yes, but for the workers, it is always personal. The work we do, it is part of who we are. The insight was unexpectedly perceptive, cutting to the heart of Thomas's struggle. The work we do, it is part of who we are. This was precisely what Thelma had been trying to help him understand, that his identity was bound up in his occupation, that losing his job felt like losing a part of himself. In Brazil, Diego continued, we have seen many changes too. Foreign companies coming in, traditional industries disappearing. It is not easy to adapt. Thomas studied the younger man, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a symbol of what was being taken, but as another worker navigating the same global economic shifts, albeit from a different position. No, Thomas agreed, it's not easy. Diego nodded, seeming to understand that this small acknowledgement represented a shift, however slight, in Thomas's attitude. Tomorrow we begin the real work, yes. Tomorrow, Thomas confirmed, 8 o'clock. As Diego moved away toward the waiting van, Thomas remained in the parking lot, finishing his cigarette, watching as the mill's windows darkened one by one. The building loomed against the evening sky, its brick facade and tall smokestacks a monument to an industrial era that was ending not with a dramatic crash, but with a series of quiet closures, of jobs exported, of communities left to fend for themselves in a changing economic landscape. The drive home took him through a Utica he barely recognized, though he'd lived there all his life. The city seemed to be withdrawing into itself, contracting like a living organism responding to injury. Storefronts that had been vacant for years now had neighbors in the same condition. Houses that had once been well-maintained now showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, sagging porches, yards overtaken by weeds. The very atmosphere of the city had changed, from the optimistic bustle of his youth to a kind of resigned endurance, a collective holding of breath as everyone waited to see what would remain when the industrial exodus was complete. At home, Thelma had dinner waiting: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. Comfort food from his childhood, a silent acknowledgement of the emotional toll the day had taken. The children were subdued, sensing the tension in their father despite his attempts at normalcy. How was it? Thelma asked when they were alone in the kitchen after dinner, the children occupied with homework in their rooms. Thomas leaned against the counter, watching as she loaded dishes into the sink. Strange, teaching people to take apart the machines I've operated for 25 years, knowing they'll be running again in Brazil while I'm, what? Collecting unemployment, pumping gas, fixing leaky faucets. Did they seem, I don't know, smug about it? Thelma's question revealed her own complicated feelings about the situation. Thomas thought about Diego's unexpected empathy, his acknowledgement of the human cost of economic change. No, not smug. They're just doing their jobs same as we are. They didn't decide to close the mill and move the equipment. That was some executive in New York or Chicago who's never set foot on a factory floor. Thelma nodded, seemingly relieved by this assessment. So you'll go back tomorrow? Of course, the question surprised him. We need the money, Thelma. I can't walk away from 6 weeks of paychecks just because it feels wrong. She touched his arm, her expression softening. I just worry about what it's doing to you. Working there, seeing it all dismantled, teaching others to take your job, it can't be easy. It's not, Thomas admitted, but neither is being unemployed. At least this way I have a little more time to figure out what's next. What's next? The question that had haunted him since the closure announcement. What came after a lifetime in the mill? What second act was possible for a 43-year-old textile worker with a high school education in a city where factories were closing one after another? I've been thinking about what you said, Thomas continued. About fixing things, about how I'm good with my hands. Thelma looked up, interest flickering in her eyes. Yes. Maybe there is something there, not a business or anything fancy, just offering to help with repairs, small jobs, things people can't afford to hire a professional for. The idea had been forming in his mind throughout the day, taking shape as he'd worked with Diego, explaining the intricacies of machinery, demonstrating his knowledge of how things worked, how they could be fixed when they broke. If he could understand the complex operations of industrial looms, surely he could master household repairs, automotive maintenance, the everyday mechanical problems that plagued homeowners. I think that's a wonderful idea, Thelma said, her enthusiasm genuine. You're already the person everyone calls when something breaks, why not make it official? Official, the word gave Thomas pause. Making it official meant acknowledging that his time at the mill was truly ending, that he was embarking on a new path, a new identity. It meant accepting that the world had changed, that the promise of lifelong employment in a stable industry was no longer valid, that adaptation was not just desirable but necessary for survival. "Let me get through these 6 weeks first," he said, not ready to fully commit to the new direction. "One day at a time, right?" Thelma nodded, understanding his need to process the changes gradually, to move at his own pace toward a future neither of them could clearly envision. One day at a time. Later, lying in bed listening to Thelma's steady breathing beside him, Thomas found himself thinking about Diego's words. "The work we do, it is part of who we are." For 25 years he had been a weaver, a textile worker, a mill employee. His identity had been bound up in the rhythmic clacking of the looms, in the tangible productivity of creating fabric from raw materials, in being part of an industrial tradition that stretched back generations. Now he was being asked to become something else, something undefined, unformed, uncertain. The prospect was terrifying, but also, he realized with surprise, potentially liberating. If he was no longer defined by his job at the mill, could he not define himself in new ways? Could he not discover aspects of his abilities, his character, his worth that had been overshadowed by the singular focus on his identity as a factory worker? The questions followed him into uneasy dreams of machines being dismantled, of fabric unraveling, of trying to repair mechanisms he didn't understand. When the alarm woke him at 5:30, he felt as though he hadn't slept at all, his mind still wrestling with the contradictions and possibilities of his changing circumstances. The next 6 weeks would be a transition, a bridge between what had been and what would be. As Thomas dressed for another day of dismantling his own livelihood, he realized that the real work wasn't taking apart machines. It was reassembling his understanding of himself, of his value, of his place in a world that no longer resembled the one he'd been raised to navigate. One day at a time. Thelma's practical wisdom echoed in his mind as he headed downstairs to begin another day of endings, and perhaps of new beginnings yet to be fully imagined. April stretched into May, spring asserting itself in the greening trees, the lengthening days, the occasional warm afternoon that hinted at summer to come. In the mill, the dismantling continued methodically, machine by machine, section by section. The Brazilian team worked alongside the remaining Utica employees, learning, documenting, preparing for the reassembly that would take place thousands of miles away. Thomas found himself settling into an unexpected routine with Diego. Their initial awkwardness had given way to a professional rapport built on mutual respect for technical knowledge. They spoke little of the broader implications of what they were doing, focusing instead on the immediate tasks: how to disassemble complex components without damage, how to label and organize parts for shipping, how to document the subtle adjustments that made each machine unique. "These looms," Diego said one afternoon as they worked on a particularly intricate dismantling, "they have personality, is that the right word?" Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what the Brazilian meant. Each one's a little different. "Quirks, we call them. This one," he patted the frame of the machine they were working on, "always needed a little extra tension on the left side. Never figured out why." Diego made a note, adding to the growing documentation that would accompany the equipment to Brazil. "And you learn these quirks through experience, through working with them every day." 25 years of experience, Thomas confirmed. "My father knew them even better. He was here from the beginning when they first installed these models in the 50s. "It is a shame," Diego said carefully, "that this knowledge cannot stay here where it belongs." The comment, unexpected in its directness, its acknowledgement of the wrongness of what was happening, caught Thomas off guard. "Just business," he said, echoing his earlier bitterness. Diego shook his head. "Not just business, culture, history, community, all these are being, how do you say it, uprooted." "Uprooted." "Yeah, that's the word." Thomas studied the younger man, curious about this perspective that seemed at odds with Diego's role in the mill's dismantling. "Doesn't that bother you, being part of it?" Diego was quiet for a moment, considering. "Yes," he said finally, "it bothers me. I am grateful for the opportunity, for the work. In Brazil, good jobs are not easy to find, but I see what is happening here in your city. I see the cost." The simple acknowledgement, offered without defensiveness, without corporate justification, created a moment of connection between the two men that transcended their different positions in the global economic reshuffling. "The company tells us it is progress," Diego continued, "that this is the natural evolution of industry, moving to where labor is cheaper, regulations fewer, but I wonder what happens to the communities left behind. To the workers who lose not just jobs but identity." Thomas nodded, surprised and somewhat moved by the Brazilian's perception. That's exactly it, identity. I've been a mill worker all my life. My father was a mill worker. His father before him, now what am I supposed to be? Diego's expression was thoughtful. In Brazil, we have a saying, a man is more than his occupation. Perhaps there is truth in this, yes. The question echoed Thelma's perspective, her insistence that Thomas was more than his job, more than his role at the mill. But coming from Diego, from someone outside his immediate circle, it carried a different weight, a different perspective. Maybe, Thomas conceded, still figuring that out. They returned to their work, the conversation shifting back to the technical details of the dismantling. But the exchange lingered in Thomas's mind, reinforcing his growing realization that the closure of the mill, while devastating, was also forcing a reckoning with questions of identity and value that he might otherwise have never confronted. At home, these questions continued to unfold in daily interactions, in small decisions, in tentative explorations of what might come next. True to his word, Thomas had begun offering his repair services informally, fixing a neighbor's broken porch step, helping another with a malfunctioning water heater, servicing Mrs. Kowalski's ancient sewing machine. Word spread through the neighborhood, through the network of mill families facing similar economic uncertainties. Small jobs came his way, nothing that could replace a full-time wage, but enough to supplement the dwindling paychecks from the dismantling work, enough to keep the wolf from the door while he contemplated longer-term solutions. Mr. Peterson asked if you could look at his car this weekend, Thelma mentioned one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, the children already in bed. Something about a noise in the engine. Thomas nodded, adding it to his mental list of pending repairs. Saturday afternoon should work. Thelma watched him, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. You've been busy with these jobs, people really appreciate your help. It's not enough, Thomas said, voicing the fear that had been growing as the dismantling neared completion. Not to replace what I was making at the mill. Not yet, Thelma agreed, but it's a start. And you're good at it, Tom, really good, people trust you. Trust, the word resonated with Thomas. In a community where so many promises had been broken by companies, by politicians, by an economic system that seemed increasingly indifferent to the fate of working people, trust was a precious commodity. The fact that his neighbors, his fellow mill workers, trusted him with their homes, their vehicles, their appliances meant something. It was a foundation he could potentially build upon. I was thinking, he said slowly, about making it more official. Maybe printing up some cards, putting an ad in the Pensaver, Reed Repairs or something like that. Thelma's face lit up with approval. I think that's a wonderful idea. You've already got a good reputation. People know you do quality work. Quality work, another resonant phrase. Throughout his years at the mill, Thomas had taken pride in the quality of the fabric produced under his supervision. Every yard that passed through his looms was a testament to his attention to detail, his commitment to doing things right. Perhaps that same ethic could transfer to a new kind of work, a new way of contributing value. It wouldn't be the same as the mill, he cautioned, not wanting to oversell the idea, to create expectations he might not be able to meet. The pay would be irregular. The hours unpredictable. Nothing is the same anymore, Thelma pointed out gently. Not just for us, for everyone. The whole city is having to adjust to find new ways forward. She was right, of course. Utica in the spring of 1977 was a city in transformation, in painful adaptation to economic realities that had been building for decades but now seemed to be accelerating. Each week brought news of another business closure, another family leaving for opportunities elsewhere, another piece of the community fabric unraveling. Yet there were also small signs of resilience, of a community refusing to surrender completely to decline. New businesses opened smaller, more specialized than the department stores and manufacturers of previous generations, but signs of life nonetheless. Neighborhood associations formed to address abandoned properties, to maintain parks, to preserve what could be preserved of Utica's physical and social infrastructure. We could get the cards printed at Donato's, Thelma suggested, bringing Thomas back to the immediate discussion. They did nice work for the church festival last year. The practical suggestion, the step from idea to action, gave Thomas a momentary sense of forward motion, of agency in the face of forces that had often seemed beyond his control. I'll stop by tomorrow, see what they can do. Thelma reached across the table, taking his hand. I'm proud of you, you know, for adapting, for not giving up. The praise made Thomas uncomfortable, accustomed as he was to defining his worth through the tangible productivity of factory work rather than through personal resilience or adaptability. Just doing what needs to be done, he said, deflecting. That's exactly it, Thelma insisted. Doing what needs to be done even when it's hard, even when it's not what you expected. That's strength, Tom. Real strength. The conversation stayed with Thomas through the night, through the following day at the mill, where the dismantling had progressed to the point where large sections of the floor now stood empty, their absence as palpable as their presence had once been. The walls still bore marks where machinery had been anchored for decades, ghost outlines of the industrial activity that had once filled the space with purpose, with productivity, with the dignified labor of generations. It goes quickly now, Diego commented as they worked on one of the few remaining looms. In another week, perhaps two, it will all be ready for shipping. Thomas nodded, the timeline aligning with what Kelsey had told them. By early June, the dismantling would be complete, the equipment crated and loaded onto trucks bound for the port, the remaining workers released from their temporary assignments, the mill finally, irrevocably closed. What will you do after? Diego asked, the question direct but not insensitive. Have you found new work? Thomas thought about the business cards he'd ordered the day before, simple, utilitarian, announcing Reed Repairs with his name and phone number. A small step toward a future he was still struggling to fully envision. Working on it, he said, doing repairs for now, small jobs, but it's something. Diego nodded approvingly. You have good hands, understanding of machines. This is valuable skill. Different from operating a loom, Thomas said, the doubt creeping back into his voice. Different from making something. But you are making something, Diego countered. You are making things work that were broken. This is creation too, no. The perspective shift was subtle but meaningful. Thomas had always defined productivity in terms of manufacturing, raw materials transformed into finished products, tangible outputs that could be counted, measured, valued. But wasn't there value too in restoration, in repair, in extending the useful life of existing objects? Wasn't there dignity in work that helped others, that solved problems, that made daily life more manageable for families already struggling with economic uncertainty? I guess it is, Thomas acknowledged, just different from what I'm used to. Change is never easy, Diego said, the simple statement carrying the weight of universal truth. In Brazil, my father was a fisherman. The big commercial boats came, took all the fish. He had to become something else, a taxi driver. He hated it at first. Now he cannot imagine going back to the sea. The parallel was not exact but resonant, another man forced by economic change to reinvent himself, to find new purpose, new identity in work he had never anticipated doing. How long did it take? Thomas asked. For him to adjust. Diego considered 2, maybe 3 years. Time enough to see that this new work also had value, also supported his family, also gave him dignity. Time. Thomas realized that was what he needed most, time to adjust, to reinvent, to discover new aspects of his capabilities and identity. The dismantling job had provided some of that time, a buffer between the closure announcement and the harsh reality of unemployment. The repair work was providing more, a bridge to whatever came next in his working life. You'll go back to Brazil when this is done? Thomas asked, realizing he knew little about Diego's plans beyond the immediate dismantling project. Diego nodded. To Sao Paulo, yes, to help with the reassembly, with training the workers there. He hesitated, then added, it is strange, no, these machines that have been part of your city for so long, now becoming part of mine. The threads connecting us across thousands of miles. Threads, an apt metaphor from a man who would soon be overseeing textile production. Thomas thought about the invisible connections that bound communities across national boundaries, workers in different countries facing similar challenges, similar disruptions, similar questions about identity and value in a rapidly changing economic landscape. When the machines are running again, Thomas said, remember what I taught you about their quirks, about treating them right. Diego's expression was solemn. I will remember, and I will teach the workers in Sao Paulo. Your knowledge will not be lost, Mr. Reed. It will continue, just in a different place. The assurance was small comfort against the larger loss of jobs, of community stability, of a way of life that had sustained generations. But it represented a kind of continuity, a thread connecting past to future across the rupture of the present moment. As May turned to June, the mill emptied further, the dismantling nearing completion. Thomas found himself working increasingly on his repair business, taking on jobs in the evenings and weekends, building a client base through word of mouth, through the small advertisement in the Pennysaver, through the business cards he'd begun distributing throughout the neighborhood. The work was varied: leaky faucets, broken screen doors, malfunctioning appliances, minor car repairs. Nothing that required specialized training, but all benefiting from his mechanical aptitude, his attention to detail, his willingness to tackle problems others found intimidating. The pay was modest but gratifying: cash in hand for work well done, for problems solved, for value provided. "Mr. Donovan was telling everyone at church about how you fixed his furnace," Thelma reported one Sunday afternoon. "Said the company wanted $300 just to come look at it, and you had it running in an hour for a fraction of the cost." Thomas nodded, remembering the job: a simple issue with the ignition system, nothing that justified the exorbitant service call the company had quoted. It wasn't complicated, just needed someone who understood the basic mechanics. "That's exactly what people need," Thelma insisted. "Someone they can trust not to overcharge them, someone who knows what he's doing. Especially now when money's tight for so many families." The observation reinforced Thomas's growing sense that there was a niche for his services in a community struggling with economic contraction, with reduced incomes, with the need to maintain and repair rather than replace. Not glamorous work, not the steady paycheck of factory employment, but work with meaning, with value, with the potential to support his family while contributing to the community's resilience. On a warm June morning, Thomas arrived at the mill for what would be one of the final days of dismantling. The floor was now almost completely empty, the machinery crated and labeled for shipping, the space echoing with the footsteps of the few remaining workers. The ghost of what had been the bustling productivity, the rhythmic operations, the shared purpose of manufacturing, haunted the cavernous room, making its emptiness all the more pronounced. "Almost done," Jack commented as they stood surveying the few remaining tasks. "Never thought I'd see this place like this, empty, dead." Thomas nodded, understanding his colleague's bleak assessment. The mill had been the heart of their working lives, the structure around which days, weeks, years had been organized. Seeing it hollowed out, its productive capacity extracted and prepared for export, was like witnessing the death of something that had once seemed permanent, immutable. "What's next for you?" Thomas asked, realizing they'd spoken little of future plans during the weeks of dismantling, as if discussing what came after would make the present reality too painful to bear. Jack shrugged. "Heading to Rochester next week, my brother-in-law's roofing business, not what I had in mind for my 50s, but it's work, you." "Staying here," Thomas said, "started a repair business. Small stuff for now, but it's growing." Jack nodded, his expression a mixture of respect and skepticism. "Always were good with your hands, still, can't be the same as what you made here." "No," Thomas agreed, "not the same. But it's something, and it's here in Utica." "Loyal to the bitter end, huh?" Jack's tone was not unkind, merely observational. "Even after the city's abandoned us." The city hadn't abandoned them, Thomas thought but didn't say. The corporations had abandoned the city, the workers, the communities that had supported them for generations. The city itself was still there, still fighting to survive, still home to thousands who couldn't or wouldn't leave, who were finding ways to adapt, to persist, to redefine what it meant to live and work in a post-industrial America. "It's home," Thomas said simply, "for better or worse." The day passed in final tasks, in paperwork, in the bittersweet camaraderie of men completing a shared assignment they'd never wanted. Diego sought Thomas out near the end of the shift, extending his hand in farewell. "We leave tomorrow," he said. "Back to Brazil to prepare for the arrival of the equipment." Thomas shook the offered hand, surprised to find he felt genuine goodwill toward the young engineer who had approached their work together with respect, with empathy, with an understanding of the human cost that corporate decision-makers had either ignored or deemed acceptable collateral damage. "Good luck with the setup," Thomas said. "Remember what I showed you about the tension adjustments. They'll give you trouble if you don't get them just right." Diego nodded, his expression serious. "I will remember everything you taught me, Mr. Reed, and I want you to know that I understand what has been lost here, that these machines represent more than just equipment to you and your colleagues." The acknowledgement, simple but profound, meant more than any corporate severance package, any political promise of economic revitalization, any abstract assurance that free markets would eventually create new opportunities for displaced workers. "Thank you," Thomas said, the words inadequate but sincere, "and good luck to you and your team." As they parted ways, Thomas felt an unexpected sense of closure, of completion. The mill was ending, not just for him personally, but as an institution, as a presence in Utica, as a link to an industrial past that was receding into history. The machinery would continue operating, producing fabric, providing employment, but in another country, under different conditions, disconnected from the community that had once defined itself partly through the mill's presence. The following day, Thomas received his final paycheck from Mohawk Valley Textiles. 43 years old with no pension, no promise of continued employment, no clear path forward except the one he was creating day by day through his repair business, through his willingness to adapt, to learn, to redefine his understanding of work and worth. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with Thelma, reviewing the household budget, calculating how many repair jobs he would need each week to meet their basic expenses. The numbers were tight but not impossible. With her income from the diner, with careful management of their resources, with the growing demand for his repair services, they could make it work. Not comfortably, perhaps, not with the security the mill had once provided, but they could survive. They could adapt, they could find a way forward in this new, uncertain landscape. "I got 3 more calls today," Thomas said, gesturing to the list of pending jobs he'd started keeping in a small notebook. "Mr. Rakowski's refrigerator, the Sullivan screen door, Mrs. Di Napoli's vacuum cleaner." Thelma smiled, pride evident in her expression. "See, people need what you can do. And they're telling others." Thomas nodded, allowing himself to feel a small measure of satisfaction. Not the same satisfaction as watching yard after yard of perfect fabric emerge from his looms, but satisfaction nonetheless, in problems solved, in trust earned, in value provided through skilled hands and practical knowledge. "It's a start," he said, echoing her earlier assessment. "Not what I expected to be doing at 43, but a start." "That's all any of us can ask for," Thelma replied. "A chance to start again, to find a new way forward." Outside, Utica continued its own process of adaptation, of reinvention, of coming to terms with what had been lost while searching for new possibilities. The city would never again be the manufacturing powerhouse it had once been. The textile mills, the radiator factories, the machine shops that had provided generations with stable employment and middle-class security were gone or going, victims of global competition, of changing technologies, of corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms. But the city remained, changed, challenged, diminished in some ways but persisting nonetheless. New businesses emerged to fill vacant storefronts, smaller, more specialized, focused on services rather than manufacturing. The community adapted, finding strength in shared history, in mutual support, in the determination to create a future that honored the past without being trapped by nostalgia for what could not be recovered. Thomas Reed, once a weaver at Mohawk Valley Textiles, now proprietor of Reed Repairs, was part of that adaptation, that reinvention, that refusal to surrender to despair. His transformation was not complete, not without pain, not without moments of doubt and resentment. But it was underway, a personal response to economic forces beyond his control, a testament to the resilience that had always been part of the American character, even if rarely acknowledged in the mythology of continuous progress and prosperity. One day at a time. The mantra that had guided him through the mill's closure, through the dismantling, through the tentative beginnings of his repair business, would continue to serve as a practical philosophy, a way of navigating uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it. Each repair completed, each problem solved, each client satisfied represented a step forward, a thread in the new fabric of identity and purpose he was weaving from the remnants of what had been. Not the life he had expected. Not the security his father had known. But a life with dignity, with meaning, with the potential for growth and adaptation in a world where change was the only constant. In this, Thomas Reed was both unique in his individual experience and representative of countless others across the Rust Belt, across America, across a global economy in which workers everywhere were being asked to reinvent themselves in response to forces beyond their control. What happened in Utica when the textile mills closed for good in the 1970s? Communities adapted, families persisted, workers reinvented themselves. And the city, though changed forever, continued, a testament to human resilience in the face of economic transformation, to the capacity for adaptation that defines not just individual lives, but the collective experience of communities navigating the turbulent waters of historical change.